Good morning, everybody. My name is Carolyn Buchanan. I'm here today to present on AAC 101. I will tell you this is the first time I've done an AAC 101 presentation in a room with this many AAC users. So I'm hoping to have some collaboration, maybe even during the Q&A. If you are a family that's already implementing it, who happens to be staying, love to hear those experiences. I think those can be really powerful for some of the families who maybe are just starting this journey with us. I am here from the University of Central Florida, but also the Florida Alliance for Assistive Services and Technology. This is the state of Florida's Tech Act program. Tech Act programs are federally funded. There is one in every state and territory in the US. If you are not familiar with yours, please let us know. We're happy to help connect you. We do have a table in the back. Some of my lovely graduate assistants are there right now. I'll be joining them later today. We'll be there until about 12:30 to answer questions about assistive technology that you might have. My goal today is to talk to you about what assistive AAC is, some of the categories of AAC that you might see, some of the services and providers that you might be working with, and then just a couple of the most common questions that I get from families and community members who are working in this area. Love this quote about assistive technology, that for people without disabilities, it makes things easier, but for people with disabilities, it makes it possible. We've seen this a lot in the last 10 to 15 years in particular, as many of the commercial technology systems are more and more incorporating feedback and accessibility features into design. So early on, where we saw only those dedicated, big, heavy 5-pound systems, more and more we're working with a hybrid model. We're also incorporating maker communities more and more. So taking a holistic view of assistive technology, we're incorporating all sorts of elements. The people that we work with using assistive technology are doing so for a range of reasons. They may have any of the disabilities you see below on the screen: physical, learning, cognitive, sensory or speech language, or a combination therein. Often there's a team-based approach because many of the people we work with are experiencing a combination of these symptoms. When we talk about assistive technology, there's a few things that we talk about. The devices themselves, the pieces of equipment that a person might be using, which again could be commercial or dedicated systems. We also talk about the services themselves. So these are going to involve AT assessments, as well as intervention, supports that you might receive from a rehab professional. For those of us, when we reference AT, it could be technology that benefits any of these areas. So vision, communication, hearing, computer access. This one came to the forefront for us, particularly during the pandemic, when many of our services switched to virtual services. We do look at mobility and seating, vehicle modification, daily living, environmental access, and of course, recreational fun activities. AAC is one subset of assistive technology. When we talk about AAC, we're talking about augmentative and alternative communication. Augmentative meaning there are many AAC users who are using these systems for part of their communication. This is not the entirety of their communication. It is augmenting their speech, augmenting their written system, their gesture use, anything like that. There are individuals for whom it is truly an alternative system. It is their primary mode of communication or their only mode of communication. That's what that's meant to encompass. There is no right or wrong. It is entirely individualized, or should be. And we do see a range of that across the lifespan. We also see people who use it for a period of time, but may not need it for their entirety of their lifespan. An AAC system should incorporate all components of communication. So when I've consulted with school teams, for example, when we're writing an IEP, under the present levels, I would write that this individual uses a communication system comprised of, yes, I would list if they have hardware, like a Accent 1000, but I would also list speech. I would list any gestures that they have, if they sign, if they use low-tech or paper-based systems. And then any goal thereafter should reference that system. It should not be referencing a specific piece of hardware, because in most cases, those people are holistic and using a variety of tools to communicate. So as I mentioned, AAC could be temporary or could be permanent, depending on the user. It could include unaided communication, meaning no technology. These are our gestures, our signs, things that are generated from our person, or aided tools, those low-tech boards, speech-generating devices, things like that. These systems can use symbols and or text. Some people prefer both. Some people have strong preferences for one or the other. They also include a range of access methods. So everything from direct selection, the touch base, to a number of other methods that I'll very briefly talk about today. Low-tech systems that I've mentioned in general are grouped by three main characteristics. So these are systems that do not have voice output, do not have any sort of power source or battery included, and they're considered static displays, meaning you're not touching them and seeing a new screen pop up. Beyond that, they could be almost anything. I put some common systems that are referenced here as examples, but they're completely individualized and customized systems and boards that have nothing to do with these. On the left, you'll see a low-tech eye gaze board, something that someone is using who may not have that ability to physically or direct select. They're selecting with their eye gaze and a trained communication partner. Across from that is a POD system. POD stands for Pragmatic Organization Dynamic Display. These systems can be low-tech, but they've also created high-tech files for people to transition to or to move between. So you will see POD used both in low-tech and high-tech systems. Along the bottom is an example of a PECS book. Now, PECS is actually a methodology or a system for teaching language. The symbols are not specific, and actually the binder is not specific, but the pyramid company that runs PECS trainings on their protocol, that's the product they sell. You could create a PECS system, and we often do with a binder and pieces of paper. They don't have to look exactly like that. It's really the process, the 6-stage process of teaching that communication exchange that it refers to. When we talk about MidTech Systems, you're going to see these are the ones that use digital recordings. They have no computerized or synthesized speech, but we can record our speech in them. They are going to be very durable typically, especially as compared to some high-tech systems that we see nowadays. I have worked with people with some of these mid-tech systems, like the one on the bottom left, that are 13 years old and still working fine. They typically are going to use more standard batteries. So if something happens, you can run to your grocery store and grab a few batteries, they might be C batteries, and put them in there. And they're typically very moisture resistant. There's a few examples here. They'll have different recording time, ability to save different number of messages. Some of them might have what we would call levels, meaning we can record a display, and then there's a button on the bottom that I can switch to another one. You could have another display that you add and switch back and forth. So it allows for a larger amount of vocabulary. When we talk about high-tech systems, you'll also hear us say speech-generating devices, or SGDs. That's a term often you'll hear from insurance companies. So when they're looking at the durable medical equipment, or DME, that they fund for communication, they're typically going to use that phrase, SGD, or speech-generating device. These systems are going to have synthesized or computerized speech. What that allows for are the AAC, the person who uses AAC, to generate more novel messages. You do not have to manually record every message in the device. They can string together words to create a message that has not been pre-recorded for them. They're going to have dynamic displays, or at least the ability to have a dynamic display, where I press a button and the screen changes for me, allowing for a larger amount of vocabulary. There are a range of operating systems with these devices now. I see everything from Apple, Windows to Android. For most people, that doesn't matter. I've had a few people with very strong feelings about what operating system they wanted their device to have, so we can feature match to an operating system if that is something that someone is concerned about. These can also be commercially available, something like an iPad that you go and pick up from a Best Buy and bring the communication system down from the iTunes store. or a dedicated device, something that was created to meet funding and insurance standards. They are both considered high-tech AEC systems regardless. The distinctions are largely based around that funding system. I just have a few examples of dedicated tablet devices. Now, these vendors have created them specifically to meet those insurance standards. Those standards typically are largely set by the Medicare system, even if Medicare is not what the person is accessing. So one of the standards they like to meet is that it's created for the use of communication and doesn't really have a lot of that other functionality. That's why many insurances do not fund iPads the way they're sold off the shelf, open to internet access. Now, there are ways around that. We can have the system opened. There's a number of ways we can work around that, but that is one of the things that will come up when you go through that funding process. They're really looking at something that is solely used for direct or one-to-one communication. I mentioned alternative access. These are just a few very brief examples of ways that one could access AAC. There are other methods that are not included here. There's a few different types of switches that I included. So a switch would be plugged into a system. The system typically is going to be set to do a scan, so the computer will move through, and then the individual will activate the switch to make the selection. Some people really benefit from use of something like a grip switch. Maybe we're not opening the hand and isolating a point to direct touch select a screen. You'll see something on there called a twitch switch. That is actually something that is reading that muscle movement. So if, for example, my most consistent muscle that I have to activate that isn't fatiguing and that I have the most volitional control over is perhaps my jaw muscle, that is one way that we can use that strength that I have to activate an AAC system. This is similar to what you saw with Stephen Hawking. He had something set up to his cheek muscle that he would use to activate his system. On the bottom, I have EMG. So EMG, like what you would do, muscle testing in a doctor's office. So it is actually reading the very small movements of muscles, ones that we can't necessarily perceive. This has only recently been covered through insurance, moving out of a research phase. Control Bionics is one of the companies that you might meet or hear about that carries this technology. And there are users for whom this is really their best access method. Eye-blink switch that you see literally reading that motion, and then a proximity switch. So for someone who, again, doesn't have a lot of movement, they're not reaching out and touching it, but maybe has a small amount, it's reading that motion. It's the same technology that we see under soap dispensers and some door locks. Other methods are eye gaze systems. They're going to have cameras somewhere in the devices that are reading that eye movement. And then they'll have different methods set to select. So perhaps what's called a dwell, where the person using AAC is resting their eyes on something, perhaps set to a blink. Different ways, again, dependent on the person using the system. Now, when we talk about providers, who are we looking for? If I have someone who's in need of AAC services, speech-language pathologists are going to be your primary provider. We are the ones who are licensed to provide those assessments and treatments. If you are looking to use your insurance to fund the system, any insurance I'm aware of is going to require an assessment from a licensed speech-language pathologist. Now, they may have requirements for additional team members to be involved, but the lead person is going to be that SLP. You might see an additional credential. Both Ms. Thomas, you saw earlier, and myself had that ATP or Assistive Technology professional after our name. It is not a requirement, however. Any licensed speech-language pathologist carries the credential to be able to provide that assessment. But as for those of you who were in the previous session where a parent mentioned she had a single SLP who's at that clinic providing the service, that is something you would need to ask. Not everyone within the practice setting does that. Depending on the individual and their needs or teaming, there are a range of other professionals we may incorporate. I came here from a different state, and we were required to have input from either an OT or PT on our team as a matter of course, but that varies depending on the insurance and the state that you live in. Other people we might collaborate with include educational teams. If you're doing this through the school setting, it's probably a requirement to have that classroom input. People like a case manager or a behaviorist if they're working on the team. If the individual requires nursing, having that LNA input or nursing input. as well as any aides, paraprofessionals, one-on-ones, or individuals that are seeing them throughout their day and supporting them in a range of environments. Now, when I talk about the questions that I get most often, this is the number one question I get from parents in particular about what funding options there are. So I have a few slides I want to go through today. My caveat, and I will probably be repeating myself, is that funding is very specific as well. Depending on the requirements of your funding source, they may carve out very specific niche things. So I will be speaking very generally, and you would have to directly speak with your funding source in order to ensure what those requirements are. So in general, does insurance cover AAC? For many people, yes. Medicaid, Medicare programs do have coverage for SGDs, assuming the person meets those standards, and some private insurances. In my experience, many of them do not, so it would be something that would need to be a discussion at the onset as to whether or not that would have coverage. Grants often do. There are grants available by diagnosis, by age group, by setting, all sorts of things. They will also carry very specific requirements. There are financial loan programs that go through those different states. And then the schools themselves. So when we talk about insurance funding, they are covered, as I mentioned earlier, as durable medical equipment. That is the phrase that is used. The only justifications that an insurance company cares about are those that are medically based. We are meeting a medical need. They like to look at things like different community settings. Will this meet needs across environments? Are they using it to access their basic needs, their health care, things like that? The medical necessity does need to be established for every piece of equipment that is recommended. So those alternate access methods I mentioned, I, as the SLP, am justifying the device, the language program, the software, and the way the language is organized, as well as whatever the hardware is required for access. The switch, the eye gaze module, those have different codes through the insurance system and all need to have a correlating medical justification. In general, many insurances do require there to be data collection. So we would perform an assessment. Some insurances include that as part of the data collection. Some require a trial period. But again, this is all meant to justify it. The report that I write for insurances typically goes to then the primary care physician who is signing off on my prescription and agreeing to the statement that it is medically necessary. So having that conversation with the medical providers, I'm looking into an AAC evaluation. I'm going to plan to go through my insurance. I will be needing your support so they know that it's coming. One of the biggest holdups in getting the paperwork done often is getting that medical signature. I'm sure many of you are familiar with trying to get paperwork to and from a medical office. The same works for other healthcare providers. So anything that can be done to help facilitate that, priming them that this is a process you'll be going through, is always advisable. Now, the state of Florida, which we are one of the few states that do, has an additional requirement of what they call a school concurrence form. So school also needs to sign off in this state, even if you were choosing to go through your Medicaid insurance. If that is something that exists in your area, I would similarly recommend speaking to your school team at the start of this process so that they are primed and knowing that this paperwork is coming in. So when we go through these dedicated systems, this is one example of some insurance language around how they define a dedicated system. That they are designed specifically for a disabled population. They must be prior authorized, meaning all that paperwork I just mentioned have to be signed off. Non-dedicated systems, that's how they refer to them, are commercially available, such as laptop computers with special software, and are not reimbursed by Medicaid. A similar statement exists for something like Medicare, and in many private insurances, you will find a similar statement. Now, there are companies that have created locked iPads that will meet this standard. So if you have somebody who is exposed to an app they've already started, but you would like to use your insurance for purchase, there are a number of avenues to go through. It will be set up for you and shipped to meet that standard typically, where it's a locked device. So they will not be able to go out, open it up, and go onto the internet without some intervention from that company. I know individuals who do make the choice to open their system after purchase, which is a very personal choice. Depending on the funding source, that might inhibit their willingness to financially fund any repairs after the fact. I always give them that caveat. In general, the process that we see is to, I apologize for some of the light writing on some of these that didn't come through. You're going to locate that SLP to provide it and notify your medical or school-based team that you're pursuing this process. The evaluation ranges in the amount of time depending on the number of stakeholders and where that equipment is coming from. Typically, we're going to, as part of best practice, trial at least 3 systems that are comparable systems. As an SLP, if someone has complex seating and positioning needs that haven't been addressed or require a complex mounting system or exceptionally complex access method, I might need to reach out and work with an OT or a PT to make sure that those needs are being accounted for. In general, many insurances put in their plans that any system they fund is being funded for a period of 5 years. So we are prognosticating out that what we are purchasing at this point will last them at least a 5-year period. There are some exceptions to that, but usually for a change in medical status. But in general, you want to make sure that all of those various considerations are being included so that we can make sure that system lasts. A trial period might be required. It is not required for all insurance funders, but many do. The average I see is 1 month, meaning you get some equipment from one of the vendors, the companies that manufactures them, and you're able to use it in therapy, in home, in school, for that period of data collection. Some may require longer periods, not many, and some may not require it at all, but it would be something to consider. The submission of the paperwork, that means completion of all the required funding paperwork, including that signed prescription. Typically, the DME provider is the company manufacturing it. So one thing I like as the person writing this documentation to let people know up front, once I submit it, it is out of my hands. So I'm always happy to answer questions about the length of time for people to the best of my ability, but all I can do is recommend it. It's very similar to a physician writing a script at the pharmacy. What the insurance and the pharmacy does from there is out of their control. So we are recommending the AAC equipment, but it goes through a similar process of the insurance making sure that it meets their approval as they determine to fund it or not. Assuming it goes to purchase, the equipment will ship direct from that DME provider, and we would initiate that therapy. Now, similar to a medication process you might be similar to, if for some reason that SGD is denied by that funding source, there is a process by which we can seek an overturn of that denial. And there are different avenues to go for that. Some involving peer-to-peer, where I speak to other providers. Some involve just a slight tweak to the documentation we've submitted. But you do have rights and recourse if the decision does not go in your favor, and your team should be helping you through that. It is very important that any paperwork related to this process, any denials or anything like that, gets to your therapist as soon as possible so that they can help coordinate any type of overturning that denial. There are some pros and cons to every process, of course. The biggest pros I'd like to share with families is a lot of the times your insurance will fully fund that purchase, including the repairs. So when we purchase something commercially and it breaks, there is no recourse. The insurance team never determined it was medically necessary, so they most likely will not fund any repairs. However, the process of them deeming something medically necessary means that if it breaks, if something happens to it, they will pay for a repair or a replacement of that system. It will also go through that same vendor, the company that makes it. So instead of having to roll up to an Apple Genius bar and wait in line and take time from work or go on a weekend, you have the option of working direct with a company that has hotlines, often ships to the house, and may have a pool of loaner devices, potentially for your family member to use in the meantime. Once insurance has funded it, it is typically fully owned by the AAC user. We used to have longer periods of what were called capped rentals. We've mostly moved away from that, so you would want to double check this. But in general, most insurance companies, the moment it's been purchased, it is now the property of that AAC user, and it becomes your right to determine when and where you take it, different environments, absolutely yours to go. The cons that I like to warn people about, this process can be lengthy, right? We talked about a number of steps and phases, including things like just getting the equipment to be able to assess, depending on the therapist connections, including the paperwork process itself. I will tell you, there's been a lot in news about supply chain issues in electronics that has impacted the AAC community. We have seen issues with shipping devices in a timely manner. They are experiencing the same issues with processors and certain components that they require for these products. So it has reduced both their rental and trial pools and increased the time it has taken them to ship out. Hopefully that'll be ending soon, but that is outside my purview. The other thing, again, is that insurance may limit the equipment that you are able to acquire. So typically, as the therapist, when someone tells me they're pursuing this eval, our office actually has been given the paperwork, and they will ask what types of equipment are covered, and I will start my evaluations that way. And I have that conversation with the family. Okay, it looks like this is what your insurance covers. That's this grouping of systems. If it's not covering it, here's what we can look at, and or some of the other funding sources we're going to talk about today. Now, public schools will fund AAC systems as defined in the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, schools get to interpret a lot of these laws. So these are going to be very general statements that I make that vary by region, state, district, and sometimes school. So this is one example of some language that has been used. I added the bolding, the emphasis, around what schools cover. The reason I added the bolding is you'll see that their emphasis is on increasing, maintaining, or improving capabilities of the child. It is not concerned with medical need. So these now have different mandates, right? Your outside healthcare provider is looking at that medical need, across environments. Your school team is going to be very focused on that academic setting. So as an outpatient provider, I might say, of course, I'm looking at you holistically. I see this need to communicate. I have seen children with very restricted activities in a school and very limited academic needs and curriculum where the school team says, well, we can meet that need with this low-tech or paper-based system that we've come up with. We do not feel that we need this other system to meet their education need. And that's a conversation that needs to be had then. Everything, again, I'm sure we're aware, but I have to say, is dictated by that IEP. It's individualized education plan. So making sure that that language is in there will ensure that then there has to be compliance and technology needs to be provided. Now, the most common questions I get about school funding is I have my school-aged child, I have that insurance coverage, and I would like to use it. So will my school then use that equipment? Again, they have the choice as to whether or not include technology based on that IEP. I haven't had a lot of experiences with schools denying the use of something that was purchased outside. The few exceptions I have seen are typically when there's a lot of concerns around aggression or the device being broken, and then the school's concerned about liability. So addressing those concerns with the school sometimes goes a long way to making them understand my insurance will also cover that repair. So once it's funded, you are not on the hook for this. If the school purchases the system and I want it to come home, will they be allowed to? And this is something I find there's also a lot of misinformation about. That access to a free and appropriate education means that if I say in order to complete their schoolwork in the home setting, or if they're required to do projects out in the community, requires the use of this AAC system, then the school is required to send it home as part of their educational programming. In my experience consulting across a few states, what I have found is that many people on school teams are in fact unaware of that language. And I've had to bring it to the meetings, and I've met school IEP teams who are not familiar with it. So part of that advocacy role that you all do so well is sometimes to share that information with them. Here in Florida, there is a great supportive document that has been made actually by our state that I give to parents that has that exact language to share. Another question I get is if my child has a school-based system and they break it, do I have to pay for it? So I've had some parents who are afraid to have it come home or leave the school because they don't want the liability. If it has been determined in a manner somewhat similar to insurance that your child requires it for access to their education, the school cannot require you to pay for it. They are not allowed to require in a public education system for a parent to pay for anything to access it. Now, what they can do, and insurance can do something similar, is say, we need to reevaluate this because if the child doesn't have access and they're breaking it all the time, we may need another system. And the other question I get a lot is, my family may be moving in the future. Will this device get to go with them if it was purchased by the school? There is language that would allow for that, but again, similarly, it would have to go through the IEP and the school team would have to agree to it. Everything I'm talking about, the IDEA Act itself, is only pertaining to public schools, as a caveat. Private schools are exempt from many of these things. They may opt to follow similar guidelines, but they do not have to, and many private schools opt not to. So it is a conversation I've had to have with many families when they're looking at educational placement. There are very different legal requirements for public schools than private schools, and if you are contemplating a private school and have a child who requires assistive technology, I would urge you to upfront have some of these conversations about what they do and don't provide and what those processes are. Now, some of the pros to choosing to go through your public school system is that in general, there are less restrictions. Schools often will choose to buy the iPad because they're much cheaper than those dedicated devices. That may be the preference even. You may find that you have an increase in collaboration and support from your child's school system on something that they've purchased and that they started out and putting in that IEP than something that came externally and maybe equipment that they're not familiar with. Now, that, of course, should not happen, but it is something many families do experience. Now, the system owned by the school can be a pro because, again, someone has to manage it, someone has to replace it. Some districts are really good about these things. You'll notice I put it under both pro and con because that is not always the case. Now, again, the con, that being educational necessity being that benchmark, I listed as a con only because, again, for those with really restricted educational activity, the ability to access their community, participate in something like church or job placement for individuals who are older, community activities, is not necessarily a factor in a school-based decision. It can be, but it does not have to be. It may not be available outside that home setting, as we discussed, unless that's included in the IEP. And because it's owned by the school, they are very heavily involved in any of those decisions, and they can have some purview to kind of help move that conversation. The alternate funds I mentioned are grants and loans, typically. What I would say if you were considering grant funding for AAC is to make sure that you thoroughly look at the requirements of that grant. Often they're based on something like age or diagnosis. Some of them do have requirements I've seen for an insurance denial first. They want to see paperwork that you've tried to pursue other options and that those were not available. Not all, but some do. Some of them do require income information. Some of them may require that evaluation. I've had to help provide paperwork for some families who've gone through grants. And some may restrict the technology that they will purchase. Some only purchase iPads, some refuse to purchase them. So having that information up front and then taking it to that conversation with your SLP is going to make you a more competitive applicant. Most grants, if you don't have all the requirements, throw it out in the face of it. It's also going to help the therapist weigh in that, okay, they're only purchasing an iPad, but maybe in the case of your family member, an iPad is not the most appropriate system. There's limitations in access methods or something like that. There are loans for assistive technology. Here in Florida, we have the New Horizons loan. It is managed through the FAAST office in Tallahassee. Some loans are available either when no funding is available, but some are available just as a personal preference. They can go faster sometimes. They have a loan review process where they'll look at the packet and make a decision, but typically they're not getting the same volume. So sometimes it can really move things along. They can be less expensive. You're obviously incorporating some of that funding. They can be less cumbersome. As I mentioned, I have had very few loans that require any type of formal assessment, team weigh-in, data collection. That's not typically the kind of information. It is very much a bank loan kind of process where they're looking at, do you meet the financial qualifications for this kind of loan? Ours is a low interest loan. that we have here in Florida. They will take that data, though, that input, and then do a ranking system similar to any other loan product. Now, the other most common question that I get from parents is, will using AAC or incorporating AAC stop my child from speaking? The actual research tells us that it will not. We have never been able to show that AAC can stop or prevent a child or individual from speaking. I've shared on the right a review that was done on the literature that showed in 89% of cases there was an increase in speech production. That makes sense if you think about it. If a child's speech attempts are unintelligible to most people, they're not being reinforced. Language learning is a reciprocal process. So the child says something, we don't know what it was, we didn't respond appropriately, not out of malice, but because we couldn't. So the language suffers for that. They're able to communicate on the device. Now we're getting reinforcement. I'm understanding that reciprocal relationship and what language does for me, and I am now more motivated to communicate. 11% of cases in that study found no change, which again makes a lot of sense to me. I work with a number of people where for anatomical, surgical, physical reasons, speech production has been inhibited to the point that they will not be able to produce traditional speech. That does not mean they don't have a need to communicate, however, so that system provides that benefit to them. And just to reiterate, in no case were they able to find any scientific basis for the statement that it caused any kind of loss or prevented speech. I often get, particularly when talking in early intervention groups, I find some people who are concerned about waiting until the child starts school. And I think the idea is, I don't know what the school might provide or what the school will buy into. As a speech language pathologist, I strongly encourage families to start as early as possible for that language development. We know that AAC can help with that development for natural speech and language, for increase in vocabulary, for lengthening the utterances, meaning combining words to form phrases and sentences. The earlier we start, the earlier the start is on all of those skills. We also know that communication is very heavily tied to behavior. So the earlier we start, perhaps we can prevent some of those behavioral issues that are out of frustration for an individual's needs not being met. So in general, starting as soon as possible with your EI or early intervention team, if you have one. If not, some of those outpatient providers that will meet them. Finally, my favorite question, my family member needs an iPad. iPads can be great. There's a lot of great things about them. They're really, they're quick, they're fast. I can replace an app if something gets erased very easily. There are those limitations, though, those access methods that I showed at the very beginning that we consider an assessment being a big one. iPads, I remind everyone, were not designed to be communication systems. They are not loud. There are some inherent challenges there. So while, yes, it may 100% be the answer and is for many people, I encourage people to at least consider meeting with a speech language pathologist to look at those other options to make sure that the system that you're considering meets as many of the person's needs as possible to help them be a successful communicator. Now, I was wondering if anyone had any questions today that we could discuss. We've got some time here. If you have questions later on, again, we are set up at that table in the back from the FAAST team. This is the email address to our office. One of our FAAST, we wave again, Lauren. Our FAAST team back there helps with that email system as well. So happy to answer any questions after the fact, but anything anyone today would like to ask. Wow, did I cover everything? I appreciate it.
So you might not be able to answer this, but what is the possibility? We actually didn't know until we showed up here that the schools could provide something like that. We've gone through the insurance route, but because he's disengaged from reality most of the time, transfer of the device from home to school is solely dependent upon the teacher remembering to put it in the bag. what is the likelihood that, since insurance has already approved one, what is the likelihood of school, we're changing districts, also providing one and being able to implement the same program for speech? I forget which one he's getting, but to implement the same program so that one can be dedicated at school and one can be dedicated at home, but they're exactly the same.
Yes. So I have worked with some teams that have managed to do that, particularly in the state that I came from. Shout out to New Hampshire. The answer is it's legally entirely possible, but there is no obligation. So the process is the same. You would have to go to that IEP team and say, every time, you guys, I'm so sorry. My child does not have access to communication in school, right? You are not obligated to send that in from home.
Okay.
So he needs something in place here. You also are able to provide documentation, so the AAC report that you had. Now, schools do have the ability to choose to accept or not outside reports, right? They get to review it. They can say, we are going to conduct an independent evaluation. They do not have to take it for the reasons we talked about, educational necessity and what have you. But they can, in which case you can say, this is what he has exposure to, this is what he's received therapy on, and this is the information that he has. Now, some of the tricks that I find personally with that setup, this is outside of your question, but I do want to throw out there, is when you're talking about physically separate systems, you want to be very much in communication with that school team about language that's added. So one thing that can happen is you are set up at home with your private therapist and your home environment, setting up language and vocabulary. A lot of people learn things by position and placement. Now he goes into school and they're setting it up based on school needs and school language. If that language is not being synced, that can be very challenging for many people to move between two systems where it's not an identical, we would call it a motor plan. Their way of accessing the words is different. That is not impossible. Those cases that I mentioned, a lot of systems, not all, use cloud-based systems now.
Yeah.
I've also worked with teams where they have flash drives that go back and forth. We had to do that not that long ago. So there's a few different methods, but I would preemptively caution you that if that is the route you go, have a plan in place for continuity so that that language is consistent. It's going to make it easier for that person, I'm sorry, did you say it was a son?
It was a son, yeah.
Your son to generalize across environments and across those two systems.
Okay, fortunately for us, he does a lot of scrolling and he does look so visually, but thank you. Would we be able to sort of dictate, as it were, the system for the school, since insurance has already gone through all the modalities of figuring out, I mean, we've done the process.
Yes, and unfortunately, the answer is no, you cannot dictate it. Now, what you can say is, this is what, especially since you said you're changing districts.
We are. We moved Friday and came here, so.
Oh, good Lord. Okay, well, you were braver than I am. Okay, so when you get back, what you can say is this is what has been used, this is his experience, this is how he accesses it. Hopefully they will take that into consideration and reflect on that. But again, they're not required to follow that mandate from an outside provider, unfortunately. Now, I have known families that have gone the arbitration route if for some reason the school, I mean, there are legal avenues open. I would suggest coming from that standpoint, though, of this is how he communicates, this is how he's always accessed it. And there may be a comparison process that takes place. So if for some reason they are not immediately open to it, they would be obligated to assess and determine what that other system is and provide some data that says, well, we found this other method to be more successful. And you would have the ability to review that decision.
Okay.
It's still an IEP process, so there still has to be some agreement that happens. Did his previous IEP by any chance include that device in it? Okay. That's another.
It included nothing. Like, we've learned this past week that we need help with the IEP. Like, we need to do a better job setting things up. We let the schools slide by with a lot.
And that's once it's in there, it's law for them, right? So I would say definitely through this process, anything you can get in writing as early as possible. I mentioned early on that, present level system include every method of communication. I don't know if he has any speech, but maybe it develops later. You want that ability for them to count that utterance so he's not being redirected back to a device. It's always speech first for us. Things like that. So there's a few caveats. If there's any other questions as you go to work on the IP, I'm happy to help.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Absolutely.
We had One from the virtual, and Carolyn, thank you. I know you and I actually talked about this question. So is there an assistive technology group similar to yours in every state?
Yes, so there is. If you go to the website, ATP3, oh good lord, ATP3, sorry, I didn't have any caffeine this morning. You can actually search by state or region as well. And I'm happy to help you in the back if I can get on the internet with locating by state. Some states do only have one location. I mentioned New Hampshire, we had one. Here in Florida, we have 12 regional sites. So we also implement a shipping system. So if someone wants to borrow equipment, which is one of the services we provide, we have the ability to mail. Different state programs offer different services and different types of staffing as well. Some have different types of rehab professionals, some don't have necessarily credentialed therapists involved. It really variable, but you should have a site in your state that will act as a resource for information, demonstrations of technology, meaning coming in and trying them out, information, I need a provider, who do you know that does this, and then those loans that I mentioned.
I just wanted to make sure I had that web URL, ATP3.
Thank you so much. I need so much. It is, AT3.
I'm going to come back there and write it down, and then I'm going to share it to everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't think we have any. Does anybody else have any more questions? Nope. All right.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be in the back, as I mentioned, until about 12:30 if you have any more questions.